you would go ahead and put your first and last name in that chat box, just again as a reminder if you haven't already, while we make sure we're getting the right screen up here.
Try this again. One of my good friends, Edwin, likes to call the hecknology because it'll heck you up. So, a little humor there. Okay, now can you know why did it do this to me?
We are seeing your presenter slide, so we're seeing your next slide as well as your current slide in your notes.
Up. There we go. That better?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. 5th time's the charm, right? Okie dokie. So now I gotta situate this bar to get it out of the way. Okay, there we go. We got it. All right, so we'll go right on back to the beginning first, so that way everybody can get started. Let's just start from scratch. Okay, cut and go. All right. Trauma-informed care, the next phase of applied behavior analysis, AKA an introduction to trauma-informed care and moral disengagement theory. There is our open source ed licensing at the bottom. And please be advised this presentation is a basic introduction. These are the areas of the ethics code that are being covered within it. I believe it's the current ethics code as of 2021 that was announced. So I believe this has been updated. Don't quote me on that though, because I have to double check. Also, for additional information on trauma-informed care or trauma-informed behavior analysis, please refer to Dr. Kolu's work at cuspemergence.com. She is perhaps the foremost specialist in this area. There are other specialists out there, but I really enjoy the work that she has, and she dives a lot deeper into this topic on a lot of her posts. So again, presentation objectives. Identify why trauma-informed care is important within the context of behavior analysis. Identify how behavior analysts can advocate for neurodiverse populations regardless of your neurotype. Identify core characteristics of trauma-informed care as it applies to behavior analysis and other human services. Identify characteristics for moral disengagement within applied behavior analysis, and identify at least 2 actions that you can take towards establishing trauma-informed care in your practice and in your organization. That last one, that's where the question answer comes in. I definitely am interested in discussion, questions, diving in, talking about hypotheticals. Please keep in mind that if we do talk about real cases, that it's all hypothetical, and keep identifying information private for those individuals. It's usually easiest to say they, them as pronouns when referring to, or you can swap up the pronouns for the individual. Just be sure to keep that privacy protected. Okay, so diving in, what is trauma-informed care? I like to start by defining what trauma is. As you can see here, trauma is that emotional response, typically to a terrible event. There's an immediately after there's shock and denial, typically longer term unpredicted emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms of headaches, nausea, and similar. More recently, there's been some research to show that trauma can heavily impact one throughout their entire life. And if you refer to the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, there is some really solid research showing that those adverse childhood experiences can truly predict and impact development of children. And there's some pretty good research also showing ways to counter that, which trauma-informed care incorporates. But what is trauma? A stress response that affects the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex of the brain is what one person says. And it's associated with an increase of that cortisol, norepinephrine, which is response to subsequent stressors. Understanding trauma is important to start understanding what trauma-informed care is, but we have to remember this is our starting point, and it goes beyond trauma and is rooted firmly in best practice. So we're diving into an area that's pretty deep, and we're kind of in the shallow end when it comes to these sorts of things. But there's a lot of up and coming research and past research that talks about what we have discovered and what we're trying to figure out. And there's a lot in endocrinology and neurology. And really, in some respects, behavior analysis is a little bit behind the times, but in other respects, we are a little bit ahead of times because we know about the consequences of punishment. And so, an over application of punishment. So be advised that that is something that we should be aware of. I just realized that was covering the slide. There we go. So a mistake that early behavior analysts have made is an epistemological error, as I like to say it. Many behavior analysts assumed phylogenetic are likely, that was a typo. Okay, basically the assumption is that were characteristics of autism that were phylogenetic in nature instead of ontogenic in nature. So basically nature versus nurture. There's evidence that autistic characteristics, though, those are inherent to the individual. So consider this in context: forced compliance, stim suppression, forced eye contact, and a lot of other things that early behavior analysts and many practicing behavior analysts today, not all, utilize when it comes to considering the nature of the individual and how certain behaviors are informed by our preferences. So the assumption was that stimming, aversion to eye contact, deep fascination with certain aspects of their environment, adherence to rules, and other ASD characteristics were learned behavior. And they are, to an extent. This is the age-old argument of which came first, for chicken or the egg. Also, it was the egg that came first because the egg evolved before the chicken. So I'm just going to end that argument now. But then introduces the concept of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is that idea that neurological differences like autism and ADHD are a result of normal, natural variation in the human genome. This represents a new, fundamentally different way of looking at conditions that are traditionally pathologized. It's a viewpoint that's not universally accepted, although it's increasing, although it is increasingly supported by science, and it's increasingly supported by increasingly accepted as well, just to interject that. The science suggests that conditions like autism have a stable prevalence in human society as far back as we can measure. We are realizing that autism, ADHD, and other conditions emerge through combinations of genetic predisposition, environmental interactions. They are not a result of disease or injury. I would like to qualify that by saying typically, because there might be some factors as far as we know, but we don't know enough. So John Elder Robison is Asperger and autism advocate, and I found this quote to be really interesting. So now I'm going to present to you the two models. You see the larger circle, that's the neurotype or social model, and we see ASD, which is a disorder of the neurotype. Is not the core assumption of our science that all behavior is rational? You see, we have that drift away from our core philosophy being that all behavior is rational within its context. And the drift is as a result of where the funding source is coming from. We're dealing with insurance typically in the United States, but we're also dealing with where the diagnosis comes from with the DSM or the other diagnostic manuals that are out there, which is looking at autism disorder or autism spectrum disorder as being something wrong with the person. But we as behavior analysts, we focus on shaping the environment. and that as the environment is shaped, then the behavior responds. And yes, certainly there's disorder. We see that. And so you see here disturbance of normal bodily functioning, normal functioning of the mind or body, deficits due to environmental issues resulting in failure to acquire skill sets, socially significant. But then we see these other assumptions that something was disordered that perhaps isn't, like, for example, preferences. For example, what an individual might do that is considered abnormal to others, but is perhaps quite normal to that individual. It is referring to a broad group of people. I have heard it said over and over again, if you've met one autistic person, and just to quickly jump a bit off the rails for just a second, you'll notice that when I talk about autism, I mean the neurotype. That's identity first. When I'm referring to ASD, I'm referring to autism spectrum disorder. And a lot of times the disagreements that we have online and with other autism advocates, when the word autism is used, is one means the disorder and one is referring to the neurotype. So I try to delineate my language and break it apart so that it's clear what I'm referring to. When referring to the neurotype, most autistics prefer, when referring to the disorder, a person with autism typically means a person with ASD. I try not to say person with autism because that leaves things a little bit ambiguous. I prefer to say with ASD or autism disorder, because that clears up my language and breaks down the possibility of communication breakdown, or rather builds communication. Okay, so now consider this. If neurodiversity is neurodiversity an important aspect of humanity? What if neurotypes serve different ecological niches? And what if societies that embrace these differences are healthier? There's a lot going on with this. There's been a recent push towards autism, not just awareness, but acceptance and inclusion. And thankfully, within the field of behavior analysis, we're seeing that push as well. And there's a lot of neurotypical behavior analysts. And I really don't like the term neurotypical. I prefer the neurological mean, because no one truly is typical. But you know what I mean when I say that. There's a lot of neurotypical behavior analysts who are up for and interested in opening discourse, discussion, and listening. And that can be hard. And when we're here sitting and discussing these things, it takes a lot of skill to acknowledge the discomfort that you're feeling. It's important that we practice allowing the discomfort to sit with us rather than trying to avoid it, and asking ourselves, what's the gut response? What can we do to resolve the discomfort in a caring and inclusive way? Every single person here, and I have yet to find a behavior analyst who is not a caring person. I have yet to find a teacher who is not interested in caring for their students. We're all here to care. We're all here to help. So right now, this is discrimination training. We're learning how to discriminate and be aware of. So if your gut response when you're hearing the hard things that are being talked about here, and when you're listening to autistics who are speaking up about the harm that they've experienced or that those that they know have experienced, that gut response of, no, I don't want to hurt somebody. That's very natural. It's perfectly acceptable to have that feeling because we don't want to hurt. But keep in mind that the response of nuh-uh when someone says, ow, that hurts, isn't really very kind or respectful. What is stopping, listening, and saying, how can I improve? And that's what we're here doing now. So please keep that in mind. So ABA and trauma, an issue of ethics. Most of you are probably aware of Henny Kemperstein's article, Evidence of Increased PTSD Symptoms in Autistics exposed to Applied Behavior Analysis, this brought important light to this topic, even though the methodology is flawed. If you haven't had a chance to, the conversation I had with ABA Inside Track was really good for this. We talked about and examined articles relating to behavior analysis and trauma informed, even though it didn't say trauma informed. And we talked about the flaws in the research, but we also talked about how it's important not to dismiss it, even if there are characteristics that we don't necessarily like about the research. It's still data, even if it's flawed. But this isn't our only outlier. So ethical concerns of applied behavior analysis for autism spectrum disorder is an article, and I have that at the end of the citations. I believe it's the Kennedy Center for Ethics that wrote this paper. And in the paper, so they stated, in this paper, we have argued that autistic children should not be treated with the dominant species of ABA, as such treatment essentially violates their autonomy, and at least contingently, it does them direct harm and is unjust to one group of people. We have argued that the demand for help to help people does not make ABA obligatory, and so on balance is to be avoided. That's damning. This is a journal for ethics that's reviewing this information, and that's really hard to hear and read. Note though, it says dominant species, and our goal is to make that dominant species go extinct and replace it with something else, something better. Okay, so now let's take a step back. How are you feeling? Feeling disheartened, frustrated, angry, disappointed, worried? It is increasingly disheartening as a practitioner of behavior analysis to see the information presented. Realistically, we as a science and a field are ethically bound to improve ourselves. So the way forward is trauma-informed care, and it starts with TIBA, trauma-informed behavior analysis. I believe that Dr. Kolu was the one that coined that term. So let's go back to our basics here. We start with assessment, considering the previous history of the individual. And I don't mean just like a quick considering, I mean like, let's dive deep. Let's figure out how family history, therapeutic history, educational history, and let's not stop with assessment. Let's make sure that we're constantly keeping an eye and ear out for these things and asking the hard questions and looking for the ways to do that. Is it socially significant? That's our never-ending question. I'll go back here for a second. One of the ones, so this is one of my little pet peeves. I was reading an article about white lies and teaching autistic children to tell white lies. And it rubbed me the wrong way, in a big way, because I'm an autistic kid. And yes, I'm capable of telling white lies, but I would rather be honest with the person, but kind. And so the issue is, when it comes to white lies, is not we need to teach them how to tell white lies. It's we need to teach them how to tell the truth in a kind way. So if someone gives me a gift that I don't want, I can gracefully accept it. Thank you so much for the thought. I really appreciate it. And then if they follow up with, well, do you like it? I'm like, not really, but what I really like is that you thought about me. This is a part of the culture of autism. The autistic community, we're about being straightforward. That doesn't mean that we can't be kind. And so that is it. Respecting the dignity of the individual. So that goes back to that culture question of what are we focusing on? Would there be an intervention? Would this be an intervention the client would select? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is the client would love to be able to sit in front of the iPad all day long and stim and have their diaper changed because that's what they like. That's the homeostasis. We all go for that. And sometimes we have to push a little bit, but we still have to ask this question and find out if it's social. And so that follows up is it trauma informed? So let's dive into those characteristics of trauma informed care. The idea. So I broke this down into idea, giving examples. And this might be a place to jot down your questions, so that way we can come back to it in the question and answer section. So be aware of that. The idea: ensure physical and emotional safety of the individual. In practice, this is making sure basic needs are met: food, water, shelter, clothing, play, and leisure. Okay. And when I say food, water, shelter, clothing, I mean, let's consider the question: is it ethical for us to use food deprivation to get them to try new or different foods? Not really. Now, food deprivation, let's look at this within context. Within context, typically an individual needs to eat every 3 to 5 hours. So if a person is starting to get a little bit hungry or getting a little bit thirsty, perhaps we make sure that they get what they need. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to fully satiate, though. So keep that in mind. Play and leisure is definitely an area where behavior analysts, as with that dominant species, really suck. And we need to work on that. I highly recommend looking into the plaque system, PPLAC at Pretend Play. I forget what the last parts are, but that is a behavior analytic approach towards play, and looking at play as, especially under the age of 9, social skills for kids, because that's what it is. And so, no, it's not play therapy, but we can teach within naturalistic environment. Pair, always pairing. Like, pairing is caring. That's one of my RBTs said, and I have a t-shirt that's coming up that says that, and a sticker. Literally, we need to pair with our kids, and we need to honor that functional communication. And this brings up an example that I like to use. So a client I with early on as a behavior analyst in training, and then I became a BCBA shortly after starting to work with her or him. This individual, they had your typical attention maintained behavior when it comes to tantruming. So to describe the condition, basically maybe bumps toe against chair, makes a very obvious look towards people in the room, drops to the floor, starting screaming and shouting. And so we were using an extinction procedure with regards to that, but we're ignoring the behavior, not the person. And we saw that there was starting to be an extinction burst, and that's when I spotted the mistake that the RBTs who were working with this client were making. And so I did some discrimination training with them, where I taught them how to spot any form of functional communication and shape it. So we have drop to the floor, scream, shout, ah, and then all of a sudden we hear the word ow. Oh, that's functional communication. Ow. We all know what ow means. So kind of squatting down, getting kind of on a level. If you're hurt, you can ask for help, was what one RBT said. Another would say, I'm here to help when you're ready. Another one would say. And we start shaping that functional communication, and shaping and shaping and shaping. When I left that center, that client, I watched this happen. A chair tipped over and hit this kid on the knee, and it looked like it hurt. And she teared up and said, "This hurts." And then he turned to the RBT and said, "Can you help me?" And they took a break and talked about how it hurt, and then moved on. Let's shape the behaviors. Let's honor the communication, but never ignore the person, never, ever, ever, because safety is where that's a big part of safety. Okay, so choice. Idea, individual has choice and control over themselves and their environment. So in practice, consent is sought and gained. So we all know about prompt levels and consent, maybe, hopefully. Let me talk about this a little bit. One of my favorite stories is with another client I worked with, where totally non-vocal. We were working on getting Proloquo used as a communication medium. And yes, we could pick up communication from different little characteristics of non-vocal communication, but as a general rule, totally non-vocal. And one of the things we're working on is a life skill of tying shoes. And this was an ongoing program that this is also when I was a behavior analyst in training. The BCBA in charge of the case said, Brian, I want you to look at this and see if you can figure out a way of helping this individual. And so I went in and I ran the program as I saw other people running it, and it didn't sit right with me. So what I did is the next time we were to go to run it, I looked at this person, and eye contact was not an issue. So looked at this individual in the eye and I said, I'm going to show you something and I need to put my hands on top of yours. Are you okay with it? Didn't get any response. So I did it and I got resistance. Like, okay, I see that you don't want me to touch you. What if you put your hands on top of mine? And I kind of put my hands underneath and we kind of did a little flap, and there was some laughter and some engagement there, and it was silly. And so what I did is I modeled the shoe tying, and this individual's hands were over the top of mine. And I think we did it 5 or 6 times where that prompt was done, where their hand was on top of mine and I was tying the shoes. And then I looked at them again and I said, are you ready for me to help you? Got kind of a smile. And so I put my hands on top, no resistance. Did a hand over hand prompt, faded it very quickly. Within 4 sessions, we were getting completely, totally independent shoe tying. Consent is key, and we need to gain it. And there's ways of gaining it even when the individual is non-vocal. Obviously, when we're talking about safety, consent kind of goes out the window because, if an individual is running into the street, no, that's not okay. But that's prioritizing safety. So that's one of the reasons why safety was the first slide, because we have to make sure the individual is safe. But we can't let the idea of safety supersede the importance of consent when we can gain consent. So keep that in mind. And of course, choices when we're running the programs is something that we do a lot of as behavior analysts. We know that that's a way of improving behavior momentum by giving choices. So that's good. We're getting a pretty solid B+A in that area. But then there's also honoring their interests. Special interests are okay. Anytime I see people who are saying we need to target that special interest, my response is why? What we need is to offer them additional things that they can expand their interests. But if they're just interested in a specific area, okay. How many times do you see somebody driving around with a sports sticker on the back of their truck or car or whatever? I'm living in Knoxville, Tennessee right now, and it's go Vols all the way. There's if you're not a Vols Volunteers fan, then there's something wrong with you. And I see people who literally deck their house out in University of Tennessee everything whenever a game comes up. It's crazier than Christmas in some ways, or Halloween. And yet adults have special interests. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with the special interest? Let's change our paradigm and honor the interests of the individual instead of trying to stop them from being themselves. Okay, collaboration. Oh, wait, I'm going to go back here for a second because I got a new anecdote relating to this. So I really love Peak. There's a lot of things about Peak that are really fantastic. There's a few things I don't like about it, like the eye contact one, which I very quickly changed that goal to body orientation to indicate that the individual is indicating they're listening. So a movement towards a nod of the head, something like that. But generally speaking, Peak is pretty fantastic. And one of the Peak programs that we have is it's determining the credibility of a speaker. And so I was running it the typical way, and the client, the learner that I was working with, just wasn't really interested. And so this individual loves all things Karate Kid, Thomas the Tank, Paw Patrol, and Harry Potter. It's a pretty big spectrum there. So what did I do? I went and I created a boom deck slide where we were asking the credibility of characters from those stories. So Hermione Granger says the worst possible thing could be being expelled. Do you believe her? Hagrid says that he's got this cute new pet and it's super fluffy and cute and you should cuddle it. Do you believe him? Right? It's using those interests to engage them, increasing that salience of the stimuli. Okay, so going back here. Here's a bearded behaviorist meme. I haven't published this one yet, so here you go. When we're looking at the problem as person versus person, then we have a problem because it's not addressing the problem, it's creating problems. So the idea here is sharing power and making decisions with the individual. In practice, instead of it being player versus player or person versus person with gaming terminology, we're looking at person versus environment. Ooh, that sounds very behavior analytic here. PvE, by the way, is probably one of the more preferred style games for autistics I've noticed. Not to say that we don't like PvP, but as a general rule, I've noticed that things like Minecraft, which is player versus environment, is highly preferred. So why not use it? Let's work together to solve the problem. So this is asking a question. This is much similar to choices within programs, but it's also choices in creating programs. I'm really excited for the new Peak Life. There's some things about it I'm not such a fan of. But the thing that I really like about it is a big component of Peak Life that one of our people in our clinic went to do the training is you present a variety of things that the individual might be interested in. And if they're non-vocal, you present it a little bit differently than if they're vocal. But the long and short of it is you're giving them choices and letting them decide where they're going. And that's really what we should be trying to do. Yes, let's use our assessments to drive our decisions as well. But include the individual asking. If we give them a choice and they don't, and we don't like the choice, as long as it's not safety, we're just going to have to suck it up and accept it. A lot of times when I'm talking to a client, if I make a slip and I ask them a question instead of placing a demand, well, do you want to leave the play gym? No, I want to stay. Well, I don't go, well, too bad. I screwed up and now you're going to pay the consequence. I say, okay, you can have an extra minute. And then when that minute's up, we're going to go. We're honoring choices and we're making sure that we're showing that we're collaborative with them. Trustworthiness. We're having consistency, clarity, and honoring boundaries. So that's the idea. Here's practice. Honoring our promises. There have been several times where I have said something and the kid interpreted it a certain way. And they went, well, you said this. And instead of saying, well, no, that's not what I said, I go, oh, yeah, I did say that. That's not what I meant, but that's what I said. So as long as it's not a safety issue, I guess we're going to do, or we'll modify it to kind of fit within the realm of what the kid wants. But moving forward, it's this. I tend to work with a lot more vocal kids than non-vocal It's a lot of fun, but even with the non-vocal clients, if we're seeing from their perspective and we're seeing follow through, and sometimes we forget too. Owning our mistakes. I highly, I can't say highly enough, recommend Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, TED Talk. There's a lot of components of this that actually shows up in acceptance and commitment therapy or training. But it's just so you know that TED Talk does involve talking about combat. Jocko was, I believe, a captain in the Army Rangers. I could be wrong on that one. Memory's not that great. But he talked about some mistakes that were made and talking about how extreme ownership is important. This is acceptance, as I mentioned, acceptance commitment therapy in action. We're literally talking about how we accept our mistakes. Right now, looking at analyst training, even 6 months ago, I can look back and I can think about some mistakes I've made. And instead of going, well, it was the environment, or, well, no, I didn't know any better, I've learned the skill of saying, I screwed up. I can do better. I'm going to do better. And you commit to action. Owning ourselves is very important as our practice. And it also models good mental health skills. And then, of course, respectful boundaries. This is talking to, not at or over. Even if we're talking about a non-vocal individual. I try very, very hard meeting with parents, and we're talking about the learner, including the learner in the environment, not referring to them as a third person, not acting like they're not present. Regularly on my RBTs, you be respectful to the individual, all levels of service. This transparency includes caregivers. This transparency includes the individual, with the exception of certain very unusual programs. Generally speaking, we don't want to be sneaky. Like, obviously we have to contrive environments so that way we can practice certain things, but at the same time, there's been several times where I've sat down with the learner and I've let them know what we're doing and what the objective is. And then we go into it, and it's a lot easier because I'm talking to them, I'm including them, and I'm being transparent. Empowerment. Prioritizing skill building so that the individual is empowered. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That sounds like behavior analysts to a T. And we're really good at this one, at least we try to be, and reinforcing existing skills and interests, validate individual and independence. Sometimes we forget about the first part, reinforcing existing skills and interests, but we do a pretty good job, as I'd say, as a general rule of field. Validating the individual, well, that's what all these other previous points are about, is making sure that the individual is seen as a person, not a person with. And of course, building that independence. So Dr. Kolu talks about trauma-informed care here. Yes, it's redundant, but unfortunately, we still need it. Trauma-informed behavior analysis. I agree that saying behavior analysis should be trauma-informed can be redundant, since the basic science is rigorous enough to describe why our behavior is changed after and challenged by trauma. But I use it because it helps communicate what I do to people who have a specific history, and help other behavior analysts understand how to establish an ethical approach to the intense documentation, risk mitigation, collaboration, and assessment that is required while using existing behavior analytic procedures to support those affected. Now, she is specifically talking about individuals who have a past history of trauma, but we can apply this also to individuals who may not have a history of trauma, but are coming into behavior analysis and are potentially susceptible to trauma that could be done through behavior analysis. Again, keep in mind that ethics paper the dominant species of behavior analysis. I really like that term, and I try to use that. We want to make that dominant species go extinct. We want to replace it with a species of behavior analysis that looks at the individual as humanistic in its nature. So now, let's talk about moral disengagement. This is a theory that was coined by or created by a social psychologist whose name is eluding me, even though I referred to him multiple times in the references area. But he actually has some grounding in behavior analysis. First name Robert Bandura. There we go, Dr. Bandura. So he talks about moral disengagement in ABC terminology. So let's look at the antecedent. Some people are likely to disengage, more likely to disengage than others. As of yet, there's no research to predict or explain why. However, the following can be antecedents. So we're talking about a highly stressful condition, a lack of accountability in the structures, a limited personal limitations on personal control, us versus them cultures, and proxy responsibility. Proxy responsibility would be, well, I don't make the calls, I'm just doing my job. So now we're looking at the behavior, and these are mechanisms, and they're very broad, but we can be specific, and we can try to apply these to ourselves and the conditions that we've been in. And keep in mind, again, we're gonna be uncomfortable. There's gonna be some discomfort here. So sit with it and allow yourself to feel it, and then ask yourself, how can we break this cycle? How can we change the behavior? What's the environmental modification that we need to make? So there's 2 pages of these mechanisms for moral disengagement, so bear with me. So moral justification. Example of this would be, I must do it for the person's own good. Now, keep in mind that moral justification is also necessary as in our fields as carers and people who take care of people, but we can allow this to disengage ourselves more morally. Euphemistic labeling. That's using euphemistic language to describe something that would otherwise be morally nauseous. This includes sanitized language. My personal favorite, not favorite example is from the Judge Rotenberg Center, where they don't shock the learner, they consecrate them. That's a moral sanitization of language. And from all that I've read about the Judge Rotenberg Center and the stuff that's going on in there, it sounds like it is a horrendous perfect storm of moral disengagement. And euphemistic language is there. But we also use euphemistic language. We talk about elopement, we talk about aggression, we talk about self-injurious behavior. Again, when we're talking about clinical work and clinical environments, we sometimes have to use these terminologies because we're trying to be more exact and specific. But at the same time, you can kind of get to a point where you're sanitizing your language to deal with the discomfort. So keep that in mind. Advantageous comparison. Example of this is, at least we aren't doing what Judge Rotenberg Center is doing, or some other organization, or, you know, we're not doing like the stuff that Lovaas was doing back in the day, not hitting kids. That's an advantageous comparison. We need to think about what we are doing in the now in order for us to engage morally. Displacement of responsibility. This one's the hardest in many respects, because we're working for other organizations. We may not be the one who makes the final call. We're working for insurance, we're working for parents, and we're working for organizations, businesses, nonprofits, and the like, maybe school districts that have expectations, and we need to follow policy. So it's not, I'm just doing what I was told. I'm doing what the research says I should do. I'm doing blah, insert whatever that displacement responsibility is. And that's hard because when we're working within structures, humans want to belong. We want to get along with each other as a general rule. And if any of the research that I've read on authoritarianism and moral engagement is any indicator, everything from, why am I blanking on it? The Stanford prison experiment is a good example. There are some others out there that are pretty keystone or foundational to the understanding this stuff. All of those things are directly indicating that as a general rule, we want to get along and we don't want to question or push boundaries. We seek that homeostasis. That's why displacement or responsibility is one of those mechanisms, and we need to be aware of it. Again, this is discrimination training. Okay, so second page. Diffusion of responsibility. Responsibility, as I like to say, an organization. If I'm the only one responsible, then 1 divided by 1 is 1. So 100% of responsibility goes to me. If there are 10 people in the organization, 1 divided by 10, that gives me 10%. So 10% responsibility diffused amongst 10 people. Now, this I'm not saying there's research behind this. I'm using this as an example. But keep in mind here that when we're talking about responsibility, unless every person takes responsibility, we have the possibility of diffusion of responsibility. That's why where I work, if I see something that needs to be addressed, I either address it myself immediately, or if I'm not capable of them to take care of it. And then I follow up to make sure it's done. Delegation is important. Delegation is key. Don't like destroy your life doing everything for everyone. But at the same time, if we take individual responsibility, then 1 divided by 1 is 100%. And if everybody takes 100% responsibility, again, going back to extreme ownership, self-ownership here, then the world gets better and we're less likely to morally disengage.
Brian, I'm sorry to
Disregarding
interrupt
or
you.
misinterpreting injurious.
Brian, this
Yep.
is Rachel. I just want to give you a heads up on the time here. We're kind of approaching the end, so I just want to let you know so that we can make sure we also leave time for questions from the audience.
Okay, and happy to stay on longer if folks want to stay on longer. Apologies if it took a little bit longer to get started. I'll try to rush through it a bit. So, all right. So disregarding or misinterpreting injurious consequences. This is an overemphasis on benefits and underemphasis on misrepresentation or hiding of harm. Most commonly occurs when people are stuck in the middle between the higher, lower hierarchies, but that's not exclusively the case. And then, of course, dehumanization most commonly can occur within our field by an overemphasis on deficits rather than seeing the person as a whole. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to change my language from client to learner, because I'm trying to see the person as a whole instead of deficits. Okay, so outcomes we can't afford. Consequence. Bandura's argument. Humane personal standards are not enough. Clear safeguards are needed to uphold moral, personal control, and compassionate conduct. Consequences of having no safeguards include high rates of unethical decision-making and increases in deceptive behaviors. So, systems are needed. Here's some personal systems to consider. Creating a personal checks and balances. Consistent, habitual, rule-governed self-checks. Self-management. Actively listening, accepting discomfort and uncertainty as essential to check disengagement. And of course, values, 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 and my favorite, upon action. ACT is really beneficial. And if you haven't dove into it, I highly recommend it. There's a lot of really good stuff out there and a lot of fantastic books that I can recommend. Organization systems. So we're looking at formalizing checks and balances. Must include individuals outside the normal in-group as a check against echo chamber effect. That means bringing in parents and autistic individuals or other individuals that are served, if you're working with an intellectual disability, for example, to be a part of a board checking and verifying that things are okay. And then being consistent at mixing it up and making sure we're not falling into a certain area. No token people, please. We want people who are actually willing to engage and let us sit with the discomfort. So there you go. So clearly defined heuristics with examples of what is and isn't moral disengagement. This is going to take some effort, and it depends on your organization. So you can start this process now. And of course, we look at cultural systems, cultivating a culture of reinforcing questioning, asking, documenting, and accountability. If I along the lines of, you should have asked that person in person about this thing because we didn't want to have a paper trail because that can be subpoenaed, that tells me right there, right then, that there's moral disengagement involved. That is something that has had to actually happen to me, and I don't want to go any further details than that. So, closing thoughts. Trauma-informed care is looking at the individual as a whole person, respecting that whole person, committing to checking ourselves, advocating for systems that protect against harm, both personal, organizational, and cultural. And here is another little visual I created. Frame your view of the environment and the individual. The frame you view the environment and the individual determines what you see. Which would you want others to see you through? And that's actually a way of engaging morally, is putting yourself in that person's place. Or as I like to say, the platinum rule: do to others as you would have done unto, as they would have done unto them. Golden rule is do unto others as they would have done unto them, or you would have done unto, whatever. The point being, look from their perspective. We want to look at the contextual whole person. And questions. Also sources, so that way you all can see them. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts?
Brian, we've been monitoring the chat for you while you've been going, and there've been some comments. So I haven't seen any questions yet, unless any come up, but there certainly have been comments and appreciation for the resources and references and links, and certainly the sources that you have put up for us here as well. I know for me in particular, your highlight on the language that we use and how that matters, and our tendency to sometimes soften things or use euphemisms is not necessarily benefiting our learners. I use the word learners instead of clients there. Could you please guide us to where folks might be able to access the slides, or do you want me to send those with continuing ed credits? What is your preference on that?
I forgot to upload the document to my Google Drive, so I'll go ahead and do that right now. I'll end the presentation so that way my not so lovely face.
And I'll ask those who are in attendance as well, if you've not already signed out with your first and last name, if you would please go ahead and do that so we can make a record of that. If you both signed in and signed out, you will receive your continuing ed certificate from me no later than the 15th, probably sooner. But we're happy to take questions. Brian, I'm sure is happy to also take questions if there are any from the group as well.
While we're waiting for some folks to ask some questions, I will add a couple quick thoughts. First, if you're interested in jumping into ACT, I highly recommend Dr. Hayes's book, A Liberated Mind. It's an excellent introduction to ACT. Also, Russ Harris's The Happiness Trap is really fantastic. Just typing here real quick so I can create that document. One of the things that happened fairly recently that I think is kind of a reflection of how to morally engage and be trauma informed that happened, I'd say about 3 months ago. I was sitting in our lunch area for staff enjoying some food, and there was a child who I was aware of the contingencies that were in play, but there was a tantrum, there was some crying. I was very reassured that there were a couple behavior analysts there supporting and making sure that the individual was safe. But we were hearing that distress, and I saw this tension in the room around me. I saw people kind of hunches. I saw some distress, and I tend to be the sort of person who likes to poke at things, not leave them, not leave things unsaid. And so I said, "This is really hard to hear, isn't it?" And I saw some people nodding their heads and going, "Yeah." It's like, it's really good that we feel that discomfort, because I would hate to get comfortable with this. It's really hard to sit with discomfort, but as we learn to sit with discomfort, as we learn to view and accept the hard things, it allows us to stay engaged. Because moral disengagement, I've noticed when I do it, is typically when I'm numbing myself, when I'm trying to pull back from discomfort or pain. And we all do it. It's a very natural response. But the way to break that is to tact the experience that you're having, to use verbal behavior terminology, and then identify what you can do differently. I just dropped a link to the presentation. Do not have permission to access. I thought I changed that. All right, I'm going to check and see if I can fix that. Sorry. Oh, not restricted. And updating. Okay. Try that again for the slide and let me know. Hopefully the slide, the link didn't change. I'll check this too. Oops, send it to Veronica. Need everybody. All right.
And folks, you're certainly welcome to stay on as long as Brian's willing to continue to answer questions and talk about this, but you're certainly, if you've signed out and you need to go on about other items of business on your Saturday, certainly feel free to do so. And on behalf of the Special Interest Group for Open Educational Resources, we do thank you for joining us today, and keep an eye out for other events coming soon, including one at the end of January.
Definitely. And if you're not a member of the SIG, please join. And if you're interested in collaboration or doing things that are for open source ed, I'm open. If you want to reach out to me, I respond fastest to social media messages, but you can also email me at beardedbehaviorist@gmail.com. Don't go to the website and comment and hope to hear from me, because I'm really bad at checking the comment section on my website. But yeah, please help further the important task of open source education, because we, this is a way that we can address inequalities by making your resources freely accessible so that people can continue to learn. Okay, Rachel asks, what has been your experience with formal listening, engaging with the autistic community, or has it all been informal? It's been mostly informal. I will say that the informal listening has yielded some really good fruits. For example, one of the authors of Neuroplastic, about a month back, gave me one of the most amazing compliments. She said that she's fascinated by how I approach things, and she's really glad that we're friends. So I was really honored by that. There was more to it, but I don't have permission to quote her exactly, so I should probably do that. But the point being that we can bridge gaps, and it all starts by listening. And then if we do feel the need to respond, the response that I typically give is, "Oh, that's awful. I'm sorry that happened. I'm doing what I can to change that." Because acknowledging the pain, the experience the other person is having, and then stating and then backing it up with action makes a difference. And yes, there are going to be people who are so hurt, so in pain, so frustrated that they'll never forgive. And it's not really fair whether you were the one who did the thing or not. To them, that's the association that's made. And to those people, I feel for them. That's awful. It hurts. So yeah. How do you respond to people that are against behaviorism? I tend not to get into it with them. I tend to focus on the principles, not necessarily naming them, but talking about building relationships, using terminology that's a little bit more general, but can back it up with specifics like building a rapport, which we know is pairing, honoring the individual, talking about trauma. When somebody is trying to engage you in an argument, it's hoping to access you admitting that you did something wrong. And there's some other stuff that's probably going on there too, so I'm not going to really dive into it. But if you want to understand a little bit more about maybe moral theory and morality, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Jonathan Haidt's work in moral foundations theory. The book, The Righteous Mind, is a really good example of that. Dr. Haidt, it's spelled Hyatt, but he pronounces it Haidt. He also has a TED Talk that was, I think, the first TED conference that he spoke at. And in that TED Talk, he actually talks about 5 of the 6. And since then, he formalized the theory, did a lot of solid research. The thing that I love about Dr. Haidt's research is that he and his assistants, they are making sure that the research is not just for Western nation people. They're doing a really good job of expanding out to the entire world. And so it's pretty solid as foundations go. There are lots of TED Talks by Dr. Haidt, not just the first one, but yeah. Also, there's a few other books of his that I enjoy, and interestingly, there is some overlap between moral foundations theory and frame theory. They're small overlaps, but I'm actually working on a book that takes comparisons between RFT and, of course, some of its applications such as ACT, moral disengagement theory, moral foundations theory, and memetics, and seeing how each of those different theories interlap with each other, and evolutionary biology. Those are the 3 fields that are overlapping. So hopefully I can actually get this book done, because some days my ADHD is so bad that I just can't, but I'm working on it, and it's fun. But dive into it. Be curious. That's an important part of being a behavior analyst. And part of that curiosity is trying to learn other perspectives, and then yeah, we should do a writing club. Learn other perspectives and then try to reframe it within ways that you understand it. And we're going to make mistakes. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. what's important is that we're curious and we're driving towards improvement, which isn't that what science is about? I don't want behavior analysis to be a religion, be a science. Any other questions? Did I answer the question that you had, Rachel? You're welcome to go off mute too if you want to just say it out loud.
You answered my questions. Thank you.
Okay. By the way, Roberta, I love your picture for your icon. It's very nice. I've been seeing it and going, oh man, I love this thing.
Thank you. Grateful for today's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm really excited. Also, I guess at the end of this, it's a good thing to announce. I'm going to be going to Cal ABA and be a part of a discussion panel. So if anybody here is going to go into Cal ABA, I highly recommend it. The discussion panel is going to include Ashton Holt, myself, and Dr. Eric, and we're going to be discussing ABA reform. So if you do get a chance to go, or if you were already planning on it, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I'm excited to have that discussion in a public forum. I really admire both of the people who are going to be on that panel with me, and I feel a little bit intimidated because they're both public researchers and I'm just little old me over here, but that's okay, right? Well, if there are any other questions, I guess this is a good place to stop. Again, if you want to reach out, feel free to through any of the social media platforms. And thank you for talking about trauma-informed care. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you too, especially practically in the middle of a move. I know it must be challenging timing for you, and we certainly appreciate it.
The big part of the move is done. It's next step is just clean up the old apartment, and then from there we're getting the house just more set up. So, well, thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Saturday.
Thank you.